I am going to talk today about the impact of immigration on regions and workers. So this is in part based on research I've done with Christian Dustmann and Jan Stuhler, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and Journal of Economic Perspectives, but I'm also talking about some ongoing work where Sebastian Otten has joined the team. Okay, so international migration is at an all-time high. And of course, immigration may affect natives in many ways. It can affect the labor market, wages and employment. It can have an impact on product prices, housing, productivity, technology, adoption, innovation. It could affect schools, right? So after the refugee crisis in Germany, a lot of kids arrived, and many schools in Germany created a new class to accommodate this. So, but what I will talk today about is what economists mostly talk about, the impact of immigration on labor market outcomes. So, as you well know, a lot of papers have been written on this. Some of you have contributed to this literature. It is fair to say that so far the literature has not reached a consensus whether immigration has a negative impact on wages of natives, or has no impact at all, or even increases the wages of natives. So what I will do in the first part of this talk, I will review the main empirical approaches that have been adopted to estimate wage and employment effects of migration. And the main point I want to get across here is that these different approaches answer inherently different questions. So this means that estimates from the different approaches are not directly comparable. And in the second part of the paper, I will focus on what I call the pure spatial approach that compares areas that received a large inflow of migrants with areas that did not receive a large inflow of migrants. And I will contrast effects from two different approaches, let's say. So what the existing literature has mostly done is it has followed regions over time. Okay, so it has looked at immigrants are coming into the region. What is happening to wages and employment in that region? What I instead will do in the second part of the talk, we look at the individuals who lived in that region at the time when the migration shock happened. And then we follow these individuals over time, regardless of where they are. Okay? And in the context I'm looking at, I will actually show you that these two different approaches can give you very different answers. Okay? So that's what I mean by the impact of immigration on regions versus the impact of immigration on individuals. So let me start with the empirical approaches. So what economists do to look at the impact of immigration on labor market outcomes, they slice the labor market in different ways. So most commonly what they do is they look at local areas. Alternatively, they slice the labor market into skill groups, most importantly education and experience. What also has been done, but is less common, to slice the labor market into industries or occupations. And what then the empirical literature is doing is they exploit variation in the inflow of immigrants across these segments of the labor market. Okay, so in the local labor market approach, they compare regions where a lot of migrants went with regions where few migrants went. In the skilled cell approach, they compare groups, education and experience groups, where a lot of migrants entered, with education and experience groups where not many entered. So specifically what I will focus on is the national skilled cell approach. That goes back to Borja's 2003 seminal paper. What I call the pure spatial approach. So a key reference here is the paper by Atonji and Cart. And the mixture approach, which is essentially a combination between these two approaches. So, as we all know, as economists, of course, we would like to identify the causal impacts of migration. So ideally what we have then in mind is a helicopter is flying around and is just randomly dropping immigrants into these different segments of the labor market. So in reality, that's very likely not what's going on. So there is likely to be sorting of migrants into these different segments of the labor market. Now, this selection has been taken very seriously in the spatial approach, and arguably this is also the approach where it matters the most. So migrants are likely to sort into regions that are doing particularly well. But of course, so it is not much talked about in the national skills cell approach, but of course it can matter there as well. And Juan has actually worked on that. So what I'm talking today in the first part of the paper, I will ignore this. Okay, so let's assume that migrants are actually randomly allocated to the different segments of the labor market. So let me then start with the national skills cell approach. So this goes back to Borjas, and this is the regression Borjas is actually estimating. So he slices the labor market into education and experience groups. The dependent variable is then the change in wages for a particular education and a particular experience group. So G here denotes education, and A denotes age or experience. Then the key variable, this does not work, doesn't matter. The key variable here is this. That's the inflow of migrants into a particular education experience group. So think of it as all the migrants who came in between these two periods with characteristics of education group G and experience group A, divided by all workers who were in that education experience group at baseline. Okay, so importantly, this is an education experience specific immigration shock. What Borjas then does is he includes time effects that are allowed to vary by education. Think of it as as technological change. And time effects that are allowed to vary by age or experience, which could also matter because of technological change.
Sorry, this is a slight adjustment to Borjas, because he has this in levels, and then he doesn't have the normalization with the baseline.
That's true, but it's very similar, written in first differences rather than in levels.
But also not exactly.
Not exactly because of this, because of the way, so because of, well, I described the shock as divided by employment at baseline, right? But in practice that doesn't matter all that much. Anyway, what the main point I want to make here is, so what does theta skill actually identify in this approach? You can think of it as a triple difference estimator. And that is easiest to see in the case where you have two education groups, two experience groups, and two time periods. Okay, so the first difference is then simply over time. So that I've taken here, that's the way I've written it down here already, as a first difference rather than a level regression. The second difference is then within each education group across experience groups. So that's this part here. So that's the wages of the inexperienced, the change in wages of the inexperienced low-skilled workers minus the change in wages of the experienced low-skilled workers. Then we take the same difference for the high-skilled workers. So now taking differences within education groups will eliminate the education-specific time effects. Okay, but then we take another difference, that's the triple differencing, where we subtract this difference here from this difference here. Okay, that's going to take out the age-specific time effects. And then, of course, we have to divide by the education-specific, by the skill-specific shocks. So this is the difference in the immigration shock of the inexperienced versus the experienced among the low-skilled. We do the same for the high-skilled. and that's going to be our denominator. Okay? So what type of question does this estimator actually address? So it's important to realize that this is a relative wage effect of immigration by experience. So the question the national skill cell approach essentially addresses is, well, how does immigration affect natives of experienced relative to inexperienced workers in the same education group? So you can actually pose the question the other way around, simply because we could have rearranged this triple difference estimator and first have taken differences within each experience group for high versus low skilled. And then the question is, well, how does immigration affect native wages of low skilled relative to high skilled workers within the same age group? Okay, so this effect is informative about the distributional effects of immigration between experience groups within an education group, or the other way around, depending on how you want to answer this question. But it's not informative about the distributional effects between education groups unconditional on age, neither is it informative about the absolute effects of migration. Right? So it could well be that if low-skilled, inexperienced workers come in, wages of the high-skilled, experienced workers go up, right? But that is not picked up by this approach. So let's contrast that with the pure spatial approach. So this goes back to Altonji and Card. So here again we have the same dependent variable on the left-hand side, the change in wages for a particular education and age group between two periods. And this is the immigration shock. But it's very different from the immigration shock you saw in the previous slide, because this is now the total immigration shock. It's no longer an education experience specific immigration shock. Okay, so you can think of this as all the immigrants that come in between two time periods into a particular region, divided by all workers who were employed in that region at the time before. Okay, so then you have time effects, and they are allowed to differ by education and experience group, but they are assumed to be the same across all regions. Okay, so the most important difference probably is here we're working with the total immigration shock, not an education experience specific migration shock, as in the Borjas national skill cell approach. So now you can think of the parameter that this pure spatial approach identifies, again, as a difference in difference estimator, where differences are now taken over time and they are taken across regions. Okay? So note that we get an estimate, a separate estimate for each education and experience group. So the way the regression was written down is the total shock may affect wages in a different way depending on the worker's education and experience. So coming back to the difference in difference estimator, you can think of this estimate here as, suppose you only have two time periods and two regions, you take the difference in wages for education group G and experience group A over time in region A. You do the same in region B. So taking this difference will eliminate the education experience specific time effects. Okay, and then you divide by the respective shocks in the two regions. So now suppose for simplicity that region B did not experience any inflow of migration. So the shock for region B here is 0. And also suppose for simplicity there are no spillover effects. So if migrants move to region A, that has no impact on region B? Well, in that case, this parameter identifies what's often called, or what you can call, the total effect of immigration. Okay, so this addresses the question, what is the overall impact of immigration on native wages for a particular age and education group? Okay, so this is arguably the more policy relevant parameter, or at least there is a lot more information in this total effect than there is in the relative effect. Okay, so if what I said is going on, that a lot of inexperienced, low-skilled workers enter the local labor market, the region, and then wages of the experienced, high-skilled workers go up, this is picked up by the total effect, but it's masked by the relative effect in the national skill cell approach. So this parameter is informative not only about the distributional or relative effects of migration, it's also informative about the absolute effects of migration. So then let me also talk about the mixture approach. So this is now an approach that basically combines variation across regions and variation across education groups. Okay, so the regression that is estimated here is the change in the wages for education group G in local labor market R over time. No experience or age groups here. The shock now is a region education specific shock. So think of it as all the migrants coming into a particular region of a particular skill group divided by employment at baseline in the region of that skill group. And then there are education-specific time effects. Those you can also have in the pure spatial approach. But because now the shock varies not only at the region level, but also at the educational level, you can also have time effects that vary by region. Right? So you have region-specific time effects. So that is definitely an advantage of this approach over the spatial approach. If this is the total shock to the to the region, obviously you cannot allow for region-specific time effects. You can think of this this parameter identified by the mixture approach again as a triple difference estimator, where differences are taken over time, over the two periods, and over education. Okay, so the first thing you do is you take the difference in the change in wages for the low-skilled in region A. That is going to eliminate the region-specific time effect. Then you do the same in region B. That is going to eliminate the education-specific time effect, allowed to assume to be the same across all regions. And you divide by the respective shocks. So what type of question does this approach answer? So this identifies the relative impact of immigration by education. So it addresses the question, how does immigration affect wages of low-skilled workers relative to high-skilled workers? Okay, so all effects of immigration that are the same for the two education groups are eliminated. So again, this is informative about distributional effects, but now really for one education group versus the other. It's different from the national skill cell approach, where, which was informative about the impact of migration for like experienced versus inexperienced workers, conditional on education. And again, it's not informative about the absolute effects.
Well, you can also do the mixed approach by education and experience, right?
So you can add...
You can add the experience, you can add other dimensions.
So you could, yes. And then actually it would depend on what time effects you allow for. right? So if you make this, this shock also dependent on age, then in principle you could actually even allow for region-specific shocks that vary by education, or region-specific shocks that vary by age, etc. Right? And that, of course, again changes the interpretation of the estimate. But that, I think, is very important to bear in mind. Right? So depending on what we control for in these regressions, and there are very good reasons why we want to control for this. So it's certainly very useful that you can control for region-specific time effects, because very likely migrants are more likely to move into those regions that are doing well. Right? But by including region-specific time effects, we are changing the interpretation of the parameter. It's no longer an absolute effect of migration. It becomes a relative effect of migration. And that, I think, is very important to keep in mind, which, at least according to my reading of the literature, often gets forgotten. So to recap here, the three different approaches that are arguably the most common in the literature, they recover very different parameters and hence cannot be directly compared. So they address different questions. So another point worth making here is that the national and the mixture approach unambiguously, so if you write down a very simple canonical model, where you start with the CES production function with different levels. In the first level, it's capital labor. In the second level, it's low-skilled, high-skilled. In the third level, it's experienced, inexperienced. Most of you have worked with such a model, I assume. And then you interpret the parameters from these different approaches through the lens of that model. So what you then get is that the effect from the national and mixture approach should be unambiguously negative. So for the national skill cell approach, the parameter you get will crucially depend on the elasticity of substitution by experience. Okay, so if actually inexperienced and experienced workers are perfect substitutes, the national skill cell approach would identify an estimated effect of 0. But if they are not perfectly substitutes, well, then the national skill cell approach would unambiguously give you a negative effect. The mixture approach, if you view this through the lens of the canonical model, the parameter you estimate here will crucially depend on the elasticity of substitution between education groups. Okay, so these two elasticities are unlikely to be the same. Now with the pure spatial approach, I've already hinted at that. The estimated parameter here could actually be positive for some education groups or experience groups, but negative for others. So in fact, if you believe that capital is fully elastic, then on average, over all the education and experience groups, the effect will be 0. If capital is not fully elastic, then the average effect will be negative. Okay, but of course it makes a big difference whether more migrants are coming in. Let's assume they are mostly low-skilled. Now wages of the high-skilled go up and wages of the low-skilled go down. So the relative impact, of course, is very clearly negative, right? But it does make a difference whether for one group actually wages go up and for the other group they go down, or whether for both groups they go down. Okay, so in the spatial approach, you have this information. In the relative approach, you do not have this information. So this is why I would argue that the total effect estimated by the pure spatial approach is arguably the most policy relevant parameter. That does contain the most information, but it's also the most demanding parameter in terms of education because we cannot include as many fixed effects as in the other regressions.
So when you say the most policy relevant, you mean if you care about the overall effect I mean, if you were to, let's say you were a policymaker and you care only about the inequality.
If you only care about inequality, you're right. There's information. So of course there is interesting information in the other parameters as well. But some information gets lost. Right? And as policymakers, I would argue Theresa May probably would want to know whether EU migrants come in, whether this increases the wages of one group and decreases wages of the other, or whether it's pulling down wages for both groups.
So one thing I always wonder about in the spatial approach, I mean, there's also the issue that the regressor, it's just the overall inflow of migrants into a region, right? And it it feels like the assumption is that these inflows are the same. Maybe they're different magnitude, but the composition of the migrants who arrive in different regions is the same. And there's this heterogeneity of the inflows is not really considered, right?
So that is a very important point, which I have not addressed here at all, right? Because so what you're talking about is that the total effect of migration actually varies across regions. Or there's not just one effect, but so it varies across regions within an education and age group. Yeah, and then you are actually in a very complicated world where you have heterogeneous effects in a different setup, and that is an issue.
And it's not only heterogeneous effects; it's not policy invariant anymore, right? Because if you bring a different composition of the info, then the effect will change also.
Yes, of course. Of course, but in a predicted way. And so leaving Albrecht's problem aside, in principle you can recover all the relative effects from the pure spatial approach. You can identify from the mixture approach or the national skill cell approach, right? So all the information is there. Yeah. Yes, Anna.
And how does the specialization model, the task specialization model of Terence Parker fit in what you were saying in the previous slide? Because there you're not talking about an overall effect, but if the effect, the coefficient estimate is not necessarily negative. It's not predicted to be negative, but right.
So are you also talking about natives and immigrants, maybe imperfect substitutes,
Yeah.
which I have not talked about so far? So, so if you're then in the national skill cell approach, and it's really migrants and natives are very much imperfect substitutes, then the group whose wages would predominantly go down are the immigrants in that particular group that experience the largest shock. Right? So that's what's coming out of the canonical model. The negative impact of migration is particularly felt for those groups that are most similar to the immigrants that are coming in. Others may experience positive effects. Right? So you can include that in the canonical model, and you can then derive what the mixture approach and the national skill cell approach identifies. If viewed through the lens of the model, the empirical questions I posed are exactly the same. Yeah, so no matter what, so the empirical questions I posed for each of these estimation approaches, that's irrelevant, independent of the theoretical model you have in mind later on. But the statements I've made here, that the national skill cell approach, the estimated parameter will predominantly or will mostly depend on the elasticity of substitution between experience groups, that would have to be modified if you have a richer model in mind. So far I have not talked about the employment effects of immigration, but they actually feature very prominently in the media. So sometimes you hear these statements that immigrants steal jobs from natives, etc. Yeah, so with this in mind, it's perhaps somewhat surprising that a lot of empirical studies focus on wages, but there are now more and more empirical studies that also look at employment effects, but that's a bit more recent. So now, if the key parameter that you now need to pay attention to, if you also want to look at employment effects, is the elasticity of labor supply. Okay, so the more elastic labor supply, then the more the impact of immigration will be absorbed through employment effects and the less through wage effects. So now it's of course important to bear in mind that the labor supply elasticity means something different in the national skilled cell approach than it does in the regional approach. And that actually was exactly the motivation why Borjas came up with the national skilled cell approach, right? It's the Borjas critique. So at the national level, then the labor supply elasticity, well, here it's movements in and out of employment that are relevant. Okay, so some workers may actually become unemployed, or unemployed workers may not get a job if migrants possibly come in. But if you're at the spatial approach, then another dimension is important, and that's mobility across regions. So the labor supply elasticity means something different in the two approaches. And we would definitely expect the labor supply elasticity to be larger when we adopt the spatial approach than in the national skilled cell approach if migrants are mobile across, or natives are mobile across regions. Okay. So this actually brings me to the second part. So I'm now talking again, so from now onwards it will be about the pure spatial approach. And existing studies that have used this approach, they address the following question. What is the impact of an immigration shock on wages and employment in a particular region? Overall, but then also for different types of workers. Low-skilled, high-skilled, inexperienced, experienced, etc. Okay, an alternative question actually is, well, let's look at all the individuals who lived or were employed in the region before the migration shock actually happened. And let's follow them. Let's follow them even if they leave the region. So this is a different question. It's a more data demanding question because now you clearly need longitudinal data, while this question can be answered with repeated cross-sectional data. The two, you may get different answers to these two questions, of course, exactly because there might be geographical mobility. Okay, so workers might move away if there's a migration shock, or alternatively, workers may no longer move into the region that was hit by a migration shock. So what I'm going to show you in a particular context, that indeed you get rather different answers to these two types of questions. Okay? So let me talk to you about the context we are looking at. This is the same context as we looked at in our QJE paper. So the background here is the fall of the Iron Curtain. Then, shortly after the communist regimes broke down, there was a commuting policy introduced in January 1991 that allowed Czech workers to find employment in West German districts that are located close to the border. They were not allowed to live there, so they had to commute on a daily basis. On the other hand, there were no restrictions whatsoever, so they could get whatever type of job they could find in the region. So let me show you a picture of Germany. So here's the Czech Republic. These were the regions where the Czech workers were allowed to find jobs. So this is up to 80 kilometers away from the border. But because they had to commute on a daily basis, and it seems that this was enforced, municipalities right at the border experienced a much larger inflow of Czech workers than municipalities further away from the border. Okay, that makes perfect sense because it's costly to commute, as I'm sure some of you know firsthand. So what we are exploiting then in this paper is exactly this variation. Okay? So we are excluding these red districts from our analysis because they are actually located quite close to East Germany. So there were some East Germans who commuted to West Germany. And that's not what we want to look at here. So they did not commute as far as here. And for identification, we also match to these border districts that prior to, so in 1990, prior to the migration shock, were similar to these border districts here. And these are the light blue districts in the map. It's worth pointing out that this policy here was part of a larger policy. Basically, so there was a similar policy here with Poland. So the nice thing about this is that it led to a large inflow of Czech workers into a particular region, in particular those municipalities very close to the border. That had nothing to do with the economic development in the region, but was imposed at a higher level. Okay? So indeed, this policy led to a relatively large inflow of Czech workers to the region. Here you have a figure which shows the share of Czech workers before and after the policy in the border region and in the control districts. Okay, so what you can see is that within 2 years of the policy, the share of Czech workers in the border district was 3 percentage points, was 3%. Before the policy, there were virtually no Czech workers working in the labor market in the border region. And after the policy, there were virtually no Czechs working anywhere else. Okay, so this was before the time that working restrictions were lifted for Eastern European workers. To give you some idea who came, so the Czech workers who moved, so who found employment in these border districts, they were more likely to be low-skilled than the native workers, and they were less likely to have an apprenticeship degree or a university degree. And then, perhaps surprisingly, it was the middle-aged, I don't know, I don't like this word, those between 30 and 49 who were the most likely to come. So hardly any older workers came, but perhaps surprisingly, the younger workers below 30 are also underrepresented. Okay, so from the so what should happen if you believe in the standard competitive canonical model? Wages of the low-skilled should go down the most relative to the high-skilled, and wages of this age group, the middle age group, should decline relative to the other age groups.
So can I ask you on the descriptors, does it make sense that the native group of young people is so large? I mean, what is your age? The biggest group is the below 30.
Seems very large, you're right. But I guess that's what it was. Yeah. So what is interesting is that these Czech workers earned much, much lower wages than the German workers, even holding observed characteristics constant. So even if you so already when you only condition on municipality fixed effects, education and age, The wage difference is huge. It's 30%. Now, if you include occupation and firm fixed effects, even then the Czech workers earn much, much lower wages than the German workers. And even if you condition on they were hired in the same year, Czech workers and the same firm and the same occupation, Czech workers nevertheless earned 10% lower wages. Yes?
Can you condition on seniority within the firm also?
That's basically what this is doing.
Not necessarily. It could be that you initially had distribution of natives that had like 1 year, 3 year, 4 year, 10 year, whatever, and then a lot of Czechs come in, and because of whatever institutional structure within the firm, all the other more senior workers get bumped up the distribution somehow.
So what this coefficient is telling you is condition on the seniority effect. So I guess what you're having in mind is that natives move out of the occupation group, for instance. Is that?
No, they will stay within the same occupation, but they're more senior within the firm than they were before. They're now people who are entering.
So seniority is measured here through firm tenure. And it's very hard for me to come up with alternative measures to measure seniority. Okay, but the main point of these estimates really is to show that these Czech workers were willing to accept very low wages. Okay, so a German worker and a Czech worker in the same firm, in the same occupation, with the same firm tenure, yet the Czech worker earns quite a bit lower wages. So that, I think, is important to bear in mind when we look at the results later on, which is why I'm showing it to you here. So, as I've already hinted at, what we are exploiting in this paper is that municipalities that were located very close to the border experienced a larger inflow of Czech workers than municipalities further away. Okay, so this figure here graphically shows you that distance to border indeed was an important predictor for the inflow of Czech workers for a particular municipality. So municipalities right at the border, in expectation, experienced an inflow of 10%. Municipalities 80 kilometers away from the border, so these are basically municipalities still in the border region, but at the outer edge, they no longer experienced a much higher inflow of Czech workers.
So this
Okay.
is the share of Czech workers in that 90.
It's the number of Czech workers who came to a municipality between 1990 and 1992, divided by the employed workers in 1990. And each of these dots is a municipality, so you have some really tiny ones. Yes?
But do you also account for the fact that other migrants might have arrived, or natives might have moved as a consequence?
So that's exactly something we are looking at in our empirical analysis as outcome variables. Yeah, as outcome variables. Yes. I should say so that there were very few non-Germans living in this area before the shock happened. So that share was like 2% or so only. Yeah. So these are the first stage estimates. So here we regress the inflow of migrants to the municipality between 1990 and 1992 on distance to border and distance to border squared. Here we do it only for the border region. Here we do it including the control districts. And what you can see is that distance to border is indeed a very strong predictor for where migrants actually end up working. Okay, so the F statistics are very high, 42 and 52, but also distance to border explains close to 40% of the variation in the inflow of Czech workers across municipalities within the border region. Okay, and the R squared is even higher if you include the control districts. So what are then the regressions we are estimating? So these are the regressions we are estimating at the regional level. So it's the wage of education group G, age group A, and municipality R at time t, minus their wage in 1990. This is our key outcome variable. So it's the migration shock, defined as the Czech workers in 1992, minus the Czech workers in 1990, which was close to 0. So whether this is in here or not essentially makes no difference, divided by employment levels in 1990. Okay, and then we allow the impact of this effect to be different by education and age groups. The shock always remains the same, right? It always refers to 1992 versus 1990. But we estimate this for different time windows. So including time windows prior to 1990. Obviously, the immigration shock that happens after 1990 should have no impact on what is happening to the region before 1990. So you can think of regressions prior to 1990 as placebo regressions. This variable here, the immigration shock, is then instrumented with distance to border and distance to border squared, just as I've shown you earlier in the regression. So this is our wage regression. This is our employment regression. The dependent variable for the employment regression is employment in the municipality for a particular age and education group, minus employment in 1990 divided by employment in 1990. So it's the percent change in local employment. Okay, so local employment, of course, could go down because workers move away or because other workers no longer move into the region. So we then contrast the estimates from the regional approach with estimates from the individual approach where we follow workers over time. Okay, so the regressions are very similar. So for those workers who actually were in employment in 1990, we actually check, well, this is the wage they earned in 1990. This is the wage they will earn in 1991, 1992, 1993. But it's now for the same workers. Okay? But otherwise, the regression is the same. When we look at employment, our dependent variable is whether they are employed at year t. Okay, it's either 1 or it is 0. And this employment regression, we estimate separately for those who actually were employed in the region in 1990, before the shock happened, and those whom we can assign to the region, but in 1990 did not have a job. Right? So think of those as the unemployed. Again, we estimate these regressions both before and after 1990. Any regressions before 1990 is essentially a check whether the pre-existing trends look similar in municipalities close and far away from the border.
Can you also see if they're reporting the same trend?
Yes. I mean, I will not show you too many results along those lines today, but yes, we can check that.
So it's the sample here, it's everyone? So all these individuals you can follow over time?
It's the sample here. So the sample here is everybody who was employed in 1990. Here the sample is wider. It includes those whom we can assign to the region. They have worked in the region in the past. The last job we see them was in the region of interest. Yeah, but in 1990, they're not employed. So let me begin with showing you employment effects at the region. Okay, and these employment effects are super large and look quite, well, what this figure shows you is the pre-trend looks pretty good, right? So municipalities close to the border and further away from the border in terms of overall employment before the policy came into effect looked very similar. Then the policy kicks in and employment in the region falls down a lot. Not much of a bounce back afterwards. Okay, so this coefficient is minus 0.92 or so. And that really does not look very promising because literally it means if the employment share of Czech workers is 1%, employment in the region goes down by 0.92%. So it's nearly one-to-one crowding out. Okay, so it looks terrible in terms of employment in the region. But it is very important to emphasize now that from this regression here, these results here, you cannot necessarily conclude, well, one migrant comes in and steals a job for a native. Okay, that's not what these estimates mean. Instead, if we look at the individual effects, employment effects are much, much smaller. Okay, there is still, so there is 0 in the first year. In the third year, they are about 0.2. Okay, so it's still negative, but at least it's very different from the nearly -1 here. And 5 years later, there is no statistically significant effect on employment anymore. Yes?
So these are the people who lived in the affected area prior to the opening?
So for the moment, this blue line here refers to those who were employed. Employed. You will see, if I have time, results for the unemployed as well. Yeah?
But if you then think about these spillover effects, I guess you would also have to see whether those guys will then go to other areas, take jobs away from natives of those areas as well.
The spillover effects.
Yeah,
So now you can look at, you can have as a dependent variable. So what are the differences? Why are these two lines different? So one reason is that those who were employed before, they now move somewhere else and find a job there, and then Albrecht's concern is relevant. Maybe they then take a job away from a native there. So this is actually not what is going on. So regional mobility for these guys who were employed is close to 0. Okay, so it's not that these workers are now more likely to move away and find a job there. Instead, what is going on is that workers who lived somewhere else and they would have moved into the region if the shock had not happened, they don't do that anymore. Yes?
Well, you want to think about a broader welfare effect, then you have to account for the implications of the welfare of those people who would have moved there had the migrants not come.
Let me come back to that at the very end. That's a very good point.
So she has 5 minutes.
So let me also show you results on wages. Okay, if you look at wage levels in the regions, perhaps a bit of a pre-trend, but not statistically significant, not very large wage effects, and not statistically significant. If now instead we follow workers and look at their wage growth, wage effects become more negative and now are also statistically significant. So first of all, let me point out, these are still not large wage effects. Okay, so let's look at the most negative effect. This coefficient here means if 1%, if the employment share of Czechs increases by 1 percentage point, wages over a 5-year period of natives go down by 0.2%. Over this 5-year period, on average, wages increased by like 28%. So this is not a dramatic wage effect at all, but it's statistically significant and negative. So what explains the difference between the wage effects at the regional and at the individual level? So the difference exactly is, but there are employment effects. I've just shown you that, right? And it looks like that it's not fully random who is no longer employed in the region. So the employment effects are in fact stronger for the low-skilled than for the high-skilled. So what is happening is, if you look at wage levels in the region, in 1995, the composition of those workers who are still employed in the region has improved. Okay, and that's why we don't pick up a significant negative wage effect in the regional approach. Now we find very striking differences in the, so this is the individual employment effect. We find very striking differences in the individual employment effect by age group. So if you look at the middle age, those between 30 and 49, no employment effect at all. We look at the younger workers, I will not talk about this, is essentially no employment effect at all either. Now you look at the workers over 50, 50 is really not that old, but here the employment effects crucially kick in. If you look at those who are even a bit older, the 56 and older, it's even more negative. For this group, like by 97, the employment effect would be 0, because by that time, actually, almost everybody later on is in retirement. Okay, so these individual employment effects, they're much, much smaller than the employment effects at the regional level. Moreover, they're really driven by those 50 and older. So here are some additional results where we split the analysis by education and by age. So for every group we look at, employment effects at the individual level are smaller than at the regional level. Employment effects both at the individual and regional level are larger for the low-skilled than for the high-skilled. That's expected because most of the Czechs who came in were low-skilled. But what is really coming out once more is employment effects for the younger groups are really very small. And the employment effects are predominantly driven at the individual level by the older age groups. Let's now look at those who are unemployed, because what you may think, okay, maybe those who were in employment when the shock happened, they do not suffer too much in terms of employment, but those who were looking for a job in the region, they are really the ones who are suffering. Okay, so on average, that's not quite true. The employment effect is more or less the same. On the other hand, if you look at the younger groups, so below 30 and 30 to 49, there the employment effects for those who were not employed at the time at the time of the shock are indeed larger than for those who were employed. For the older ones, on the other hand, they are smaller, but that's in large part driven by the fact that at that time in the 1990s, if you were not in job and you were like 55 years old, the probability that you found a job again was actually quite low. Okay, so that's basically why these employment effects for this group in particular tend to be quite small. I think I need to conclude. So what you really should take away is that the large employment effects at the regional level do not go hand in hand with equally large employment effects at the individual level. So at the individual level, employment effects are much, much smaller. So what explains these differences? So one explanation is that these residence workers move away and find employment elsewhere. So that actually we've looked very carefully, and that's not really driving this difference. Instead, what is driving the difference is that workers who lived somewhere else, they now no longer move into the region. And now I come back to the question Michael asked. Of course, if we want to have a full welfare analysis, we would like to know what happened to the welfare of these workers who now no longer move into the region. And that's unfortunately a very tricky question to answer, right? Because we don't see in our data. These are the workers who would have moved in, but now no longer moved in. But let's think about it, right? So they were employed in whatever, Hamburg, Frankfurt, who knows where. And they would have moved to this other area in the time of the shock. They can move to, if they want to leave where they live, right? They have tons of other choices where they can possibly move to. So to me, this suggests that maybe their welfare was not all that much affected. Right? Because just this particular region is just one of the many regions they possibly could have moved to.
Do you have any evidence of all of this? So was there an inflow of people like from Germany to this area before?
Yes.
Okay, was substantial?
Yes.
Okay. And can you rule out commuting in point one?
In point one?
Commuting.
So neither commuting nor moving so far away that realistically you cannot commute is important. So the outflow side is just not very important. And yes, thank you.
Okay. Very.
So with this no immigration thing in this particular time period is also quite relevant for the Eastern Germans, right? So maybe the control regions were receiving all this Eastern.
That we made sure was not the case.
This is not the case.
Not the case.
So the immigrants that don't go to these border regions, they're not Eastern Germans that don't go there. This is Western Germans.
I mean, it's hard to say for sure, right? But what I can tell you, prior to the shock, there was like annually 14% or so came into the region from elsewhere in West Germany. Before the shock, obviously not from East Germany, because that was not possible.
Okay, so thank you very much.